Welcome to week 3 of our series, For You, For All, 500 Years and Going Strong. This week our conversation turns to grace. Pastor Paul, do you want to bring us up to where we're at this week?
Well, these past few weeks, we have talked about how God has saved us and how Luther tried to teach the church a new understanding of the way that God is at work in our world and in our lives, and that salvation comes not because of what we have done to earn it, but because God has chosen to give it to us as a free gift, which is a definition of grace. But it seems to me none of us can appreciate the gift of grace until we have a better understanding, a better grasp of just how desperate our situation is, which means we got to understand more clearly what we mean when we say sin. Most of us feel like we have a pretty good idea of what sin must be. Sin, at the very least, seems to be breaking God's rules, breaking any of the Ten Commandments. So sin would be things like worshiping idols or other gods, taking God's name in vain. There'd be murder or adultery or stealing or lying or defrauding others. Those are pretty easy to nail. But actually, Luther, as he was talking about sin, he would say all the sins like that, from breaking those 10 commandments, would be sins he defined as sins with a little s. And that all those sins actually come from our root condition, which is sin with a big S, which he defined with just one word: unbelief. Unbelief is what is at the heart of every human being. Unbelief is what keeps us from being able to trust God and to trust all the promises that God made to us. And because we don't trust God, because we don't love or trust God, we feel that we have to do for ourselves what we inherently believe God is not going to do for us. So if God's not going to provide for us, then we have to find ways to provide for ourselves. And the ways that we often choose to provide for ourselves, whether in terms of emotional intimacy, whether in terms of material wealth, even in terms of a relationship with God, all invariably bear in our lives all those sins with little s's. And as try as we can't seem to get our hearts any closer to God on our own, to be able to believe in the promises that God made to us anymore from the day we're born into this world, from the day that we leave this world. That sin with a capital S is always part of our condition. And to get at that a little bit, I'm going to turn our listeners into a Bible story, Luke chapter 7, and you'll see the verses here shortly. It's a story of Jesus being invited to a dinner party. And as you read the story, I want you to be conscious of where sin is suggested to be present in the story. And we're going to see if you can name that when we get back here in a little bit. Well, in the story that you just read, you met two characters at dinner with Jesus. One is a fellow named Simon, a Pharisee, one who was very intentionally and strictly keeping the 10 Commandments, and one who is only identified as a sinner. And we're never told exactly what her sin was, only that it must have been fairly obvious and public to those around her. So I don't know if you had fun with thinking about what their sin might be in either case, but I do want to leave you with this one little telling part of Jesus' parable. If he talked to the two people who both owed debts, one owed a little, one owed a lot, and yet the phrase that he uses to describe both is, neither could pay back what they owe. And all of a sudden, with that phrase, there is a great equalizer in terms of how sin leaves us all standing in the need of grace.
So now that we have that common understanding of what sin is, Pastor Chris, will you take us next to the conversation about what is grace and what does it look like?
Thank you for the question, Holly. In all honesty, being asked what is grace is one of those questions that that is unnerving, because it's one of those things that we talk about so often, and yet it's one of those things that it's like, what is grace, and how it's just so amazing, but what is it really? It's one of those huge things. And so as I started to think about grace, one of the first things that popped to mind for me was Ephesians 2, because it's in there that Paul is writing and really kind of gets at the heart of grace. In Ephesians 2 we read, "But God, who is rich in mercy, out of great love with which he loved us, even when we were dead through our trespasses, made us alive together with Christ. For by grace you have been saved through faith. This is not your own doing, it is a gift of God, not the result of works, so that no one may boast." That is, this grace is completely given by God, and there is absolutely nothing that we do to accept it, earn it, do something good in return for it. Grace is just lavished as a gift from God. It is Christ taking on all of our sin, all of our guilt, all of the forces that separate us from God, and giving us the goodness, the wholeness, the amazing gifts of Christ. And that gift is just given. And that's what makes it so hard, is that it just flows. And one of the things that it's important to take a look at, especially in this story that we read from Luke, is to look at the role of grace in the passage, just like we looked at the role of sin in the passage. So go ahead and go back, take a look at those verses again, and say, where's the grace?
One of the things I love about this passage is it doesn't just play with our idea of sin and how that works in our lives, but gives us such a fabulous idea of grace. And Jesus in his language uses these words of debt, that when we sin, it's somehow counting against us in this credit. And this would have been a very common image in Jesus' day for talking about these ways that we sin against God and gets counted against us in kind of this almost divine bank account. But in this passage then, really we should be insulted by everything Jesus says here. Because this grace, this gift that is given, smashes our idea of what is fair, of what is sensible, and it just really does want to irk us, because I'm going to guess that many of us do see ourselves as Simon, as people who are trying to live good lives, and we can point to those people who live down the street who just are messing life up and doing everything wrong, and we know that we're better. We don't always want to admit that, but I think sometimes we have to be honest in trying to be real, that we do like to point to others in their sin more than we like to see our own. And that's part of the insult here, or the harshness, and for the crowd that listens to this in Jesus' teaching, is that we've already heard this verse, when they could not pay, to point to that sin, that everyone's in the same boat. But in that very same verse then, we get such words of grace, because it continues in verse 42, when they could not pay, he canceled the debts of both of them. And there we get these wonderful words of grace, of what God is doing, that we're all in this same level playing field. We're all in the same position, that no matter what we've done or how well we've lived or what we've done wrong, we simply don't measure up. And it doesn't matter how great we think our debt is versus someone else's. None of us can pay. And we're all in need of this gift of grace from God. And so this gift is both free because it comes from God, but is also freeing for us, and how it allows us then to live in our world and to live in response to this gift. Now, I say that the gift is free. The truth is, it's free for us, but it came at a great price for Jesus. And so that price is paid, that sacrifice is made by God on our behalf. And so then the question then becomes, how is this freeing for us? As our life of receiving grace, does it look just like it did before, being trapped in sin and bondage, or somehow this gift of grace allows us to live in our world differently? And I think this image of debt is so fascinating for me, because as the creditor forgives their debt, it means that their debt is wiped away. And these debtors who owe this money, they can live their life as if they're still indebted, as if they still owe these great sums, and they can live as if that weight is still on their shoulders. But the truth is they don't owe it. And it doesn't matter how hard they try to work to pay it back. It's not owed. And that wasn't something they did. It wasn't even something they asked for in this story. That was the gift. And so their response is to either live in that same indebtedness, to live as debtors, to live under this feeling that I'm sure it must pain them to owe such a great sum that can't be paid back, or to live freed, to respond to this generous gift in new ways, and to let this gift be life-giving. I think for us, that's the challenge in receiving gifts and receiving God's grace, is to recognize that God has paid this and that we are free. But freed not just to go back to the same places that's put us in debt to begin with, but to be free to live in new life, in the joy that comes with knowing God's grace and receiving God's love and mercy.
Amazing grace, a free gift from God for all of us. We invite you to continue your conversation and fellowship with your small group, and we'll see you back here next week.